I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to a special episode focusing on the WSET Diploma D3 theory exam. Today, McHale MW covers the 8 most commonly made mistakes based on her extensive analysis of recent examiners' reports, and describes examples of mistakes taken from past exams, and gives tips on how to address each of these. To follow the discussion, I'd recommend accessing the October 2021 D3 exam from your online classroom and having this in front of you while you listen along. I've included timestamps which can be used to navigate between the 8 mistakes if you need to revisit or skip to any one of these. Surely essential listening for you, friends, colleagues or classmates sitting the D3 theory exam in May 2023. So do please share the direct episode link widely, which is interpretingwine.com/488. Enjoy.
Now, interestingly, the D3 theory exams have a much lower pass rate than D3 tasting, even though when you think about, taking a blind tasting exam, it's the tasting that can feel the most daunting. But if you actually look at the figures, way more people pass the tasting first time than pass the theory. And when I saw the pass rates that came out from the 2021 D3 theory exams, I was a bit shocked. It was sort of between 50 and 60% pass rate, which is quite low. And obviously these are challenging exams, but those are still low pass rates. And so I went on a bit of a mission during 2022 to really address these issues and to help people pass this exam, because it's worth 25%. Combined with the tasting, the module is worth 50% of the overall diploma. So it is really significant. If you can get the D3 theory exam under your belt, then you're probably going to have overcome the biggest obstacle to becoming WSET, which is, of course, what everybody wants. Everyone wants those letters at the end of their name. So in order to try and help people with this, what I did last year was extensive analysis of the most recently available examiners' reports. And at the time of this recording, those are still the most recently available ones. So we had a report on the January and May 2021 exams, and then more recently on the October 2021 exams. So what I'd like to talk about today is the themes that I drew out specifically from the October 2021 examiner's report. So I went through that in detail and I came up with 8 most commonly made mistakes. So over and over again, the examiners mentioned these specific mistakes. And what I did then was put together a little training. Some of you may have actually attended the live training I ran on this during 2022. I put a training together outlining each of the 8 mistakes and then how you can address that mistake. And so what we'll do in today's discussion is go through the key points and, if possible, give examples from the October 2021 exams. So if you are a D3 theory student and you're listening to this, it might be a good idea to pause the recording right now and go and get hold of the October 2021 exam questions, because I may make some reference to those. So mistake number 1, and this mistake came up throughout the 2021 examiners' reports, and this is not respecting the marking weightings given. Okay. So for example, in October 2021, the examiners commented upon this in the context of question 2 on the strengths and weaknesses of Greece. And it is useful to learn here that when they ask a strengths and weaknesses question, they expect you to give roughly equal weighting to each of strengths and weaknesses. So I think that's useful information. And this mistake comes up frequently throughout the D3 examiners' reports. So it is really important that you don't make this mistake. So how do you fix this? Okay. So sometimes, of course, you may have no choice but to write less in one of the sections, because we don't all have a photographic memory. Sometimes under exam pressure, you can't quite recall enough detail. But in my experience, most of the time when people disrespect the marking weightings, it's because they're not planning their time properly. So quite apart from the issue of not being able to remember enough detail, let's say you've got a 40% weighting and a 60% weighting, and you just can't quite remember enough of the content of the second part, so you end up only writing 30%'s worth. So quite apart from that issue, you can actually address this by planning your time better. So my key tip here is to practice exam time management in advance. So what I suggest is that you first attempt a past exam question in what I call an open way, i.e. where you do make reference to the D3 online book. So you're not trying to do it from memory. And this will then help you gather together all the material and write the answer accurately according to the marking weightings. Then what I would suggest is that a week or so later, you rewrite the answer under exam conditions and check afterwards that you have respected the weightings. And the more you practice this, the more natural this will become under pressure. If you want to get really accurate, it's a good idea to do a few calculations in advance of how long you should spend on each part of the questions. And I would use the most commonly appearing weightings. So if you base this on 35 minutes per question, which allows for 5 minutes for planning and checking, then if the weighting is a 40-60 split, so that example I've just given you, the first part of the question is worth 40%, the second 60%, calculate those percentages, and then you'll work out that you'll need to spend 14 minutes on the first part and 21 on the second part. And if you look through the past exam questions, there are weightings that appear most commonly. So quite often you've got a third, and a third, sometimes 50-50, and just have in mind roughly how long you should be spending on each part in all of these different question types. You don't have to stick, obviously, to 14 minutes and 21 minutes exactly, but it's just useful to have an approximate idea. You have your little timer in front of you in the exam, and then you force yourself to move on at the end of those roughly 14, 15 minutes, whatever it is. This will keep you on track so that you don't make this mistake simply because of bad time management. In other cases, people quite simply, again, due to exam pressure, just don't pay attention to the weightings. I'm sure you have been there. I have been there myself, where I have been stressed in an exam and haven't read the question properly, and I haven't read exactly how they're marking it. So you must take proper note of the marking weightings. Okay, it's a terrible waste if you fail a question not because you didn't know the material, but because you simply didn't read the weightings properly. So those are my tips for how to tackle mistake number one.
Really good advice. And thinking back to my exam days and techniques, really, something I always was told was that really in the mindset of the markers, they're actually looking to give you marks, rather than take marks away, that, they want to reward your knowledge. So at that stage, then, when you, as you said, you've allocated the time for planning, is it a good idea to draw a plan, to actually, note down that information that you're planning to use in your fuller answer, so that, if perhaps, you do run out of time and you do have to sort of move on, that there's at least that outline, which is in a way that the examiners can see and can actually give you some credit for.
Yeah, I would say that if you're really strict with your time management, you will be forcing yourself to move on at the end of each 40-minute segment to move on to the next question. And like you say, there may come a time where, you're at your 39th minute and you realize you still have maybe 6 key points to make. And yes, I would absolutely advise just getting those down on the page. It may not look as polished as it would otherwise have looked if you'd had the time to complete it. Perhaps what you might want to think about doing is having those points noted. They're probably noted on your essay plan anyway, your answer plan. And then it may be that the third question that you answer, you do quite quickly. So you might have some time to come back and finish properly your first question. If you don't, though, that would be the moment to bullet point those final 6 key pieces of information that you had in your head and you want to show the examiner that you knew. Okay, so mistake number 2 is really about the balance between how much you're relying on D1 and D2 material to answer the D3 questions, or how much you're relying on the D3 material. A holistic grasp of all 3 of these modules is required to succeed at D3. And examiners frequently comment on students not having prepared all 3 of them. So, for example, if you look at the October report, this is in evidence in the commentary on question 3. They say that the best candidates also included learning from their D2 studies. It also appeared in question 6, where they criticised the lack of D3 knowledge. They said weaker candidates offered lengthy generalised descriptions without localising these observations and making them relevant. And then in question 7, they say the danger is that answers revert to a generic discussion of viticulture and winemaking that is not specific to the region. And then finally, whilst they don't mention this specifically in the October report, I noted when I was analysing the January and May reports that candidates are frequently required also to expand a little on the D3 material. So in other words, that means you're not just using what's in the D3 book, you are extrapolating, and that could be extrapolating using concepts from D1 or D2. So using your understanding of those concepts to add meat to the bones, if you like, of the D3 content. Sometimes this could come from extra reading. And I know that we all have very limited time when we're preparing for D3 because there's already such a vast amount of material in the book itself. So my advice is that rather than, sort of lumbering yourself with hundreds of extra books to read or articles to read, start with the additional links that they include in the D3 book. Make sure you do click on those links and draw out any extra points that are there. And if you have more time, then of course you can take that further with other books or online articles, usually from sources like the Drinks Business, etc., where there's a lot of great analysis. But sometimes you do need that little bit of extra content above and beyond the D3 material. So how do you fix mistake number 2? Now, this is, of course, easier said than done, but the key method for preventing mistake number 2 is to allocate plenty of time to your studies for this exam. This is so that you can comprehensively cover and learn as much as possible from the D3 material, including clicking on those extra links, as well as leaving time in your study plan for a solid review of your D1 and D2 notes, and always making links between all the materials where you can. And I'll discuss that when we look at mistake number 4 a bit later.
Yeah, I think this is also a good time, Anne, to mention a question that I've received from one of my listeners, which is actually exactly about that, drawing from D1 and D2. This particular student took these modules some time ago. I believe, there's gaps because of COVID and travel restrictions. And I feel there may be a lot of other people who are in that, same sort of situation. So, what kind of tips and advice might you have for, drawing in the D1 and D2 advice when the exam that they took for that might have been 18 months ago or, even longer in some cases?
Yes, a big challenge indeed. And I feel for you. And I think a lot of people are in that position, particularly due to the kind of the COVID gaps, travel restrictions, like you say, the backlog of trying to catch up on everything. So the key thing I would say is, although it may seem like you are wasting time by going over D1 and D2 instead of, immediately just diving into the vast amount of D3 material. You're actually setting yourself up for a solid foundation if you take the time to comprehensively review the study notes that you made for D1 and D2 when you took those exams. If you didn't make notes at that time and instead you simply relied on reading the modules in the online book, then do that again. I prefer personally to make my own notes to try and distill the content down. So if you have time to do that, then it really is going to be time well spent, because the foundation of every single answer in the D3 theory exam is, I would say, probably primarily D1, but with elements of D2 as well. So it is going to be time well spent, even if you think, I can't spare that extra week or 3 or 4 intensive days, whatever it is, to go through that material. It is actually overall going to save you time. Mistake number 3 is not structuring your answers logically. This is a very frequent complaint of the examiners. It emerges in the October report. It emerges in question 3 on Carmenere and Torrentes, and in question 4, which was on comparisons between Australian regions, they give examples about how candidates could have used a clearer structure. So I'll let you have a look at those questions and see what I'm talking about. Now, how do you fix mistake number 3? So first of all, remember that many times they do give you structural clues in the question. So for instance, similarities and differences, or strengths and weaknesses. If that's the case, then please use that structure rather than rambling in a random fashion. I have marked many wine exam and wine practice assignment essays in my time as an educator. And I can say that it is extremely frustrating when people ramble. Lawrence, as you said, examiners do actually want to give you marks. They're not there to try and fail you, but it's very hard for them to give you marks if they cannot follow the logic of your answer. And as with mistake number 1, practice is key. So using that same tip that I mentioned for helping with the marking weightings, use that for a structure as well. So write answers to as many past questions as you can. First of all, with no time limit, having the materials in front of you. Pay careful consideration to the logic of your structure. Make sure that you're addressing any command verbs in the question. And these command verbs are very important to understand. If you're not aware of those, then do check out the theory guidance document, which is available in your online classroom. This could be really, really useful in the case of the example that I gave you on the Australian regions, where there might perhaps be more than one way of structuring the answer, and then redo your answer a short while later under timed conditions. And this discipline will help you get better at this. In the exam itself, as well as in any timed answers that you do as preparation, planning is key. So use whichever method works for you, whether that be mind maps or bullet points, but do spend 3 to 5 minutes drawing up a brief plan of your answer structure before you start writing. And as I've said, when an examiner reads an answer, when a clear structure is laid out for the reader, that candidate stands out very positively in that big pile of papers that examiner is marking. So it really is worth your while putting energy into getting better at this. Mistake number 4, not including the right amount of detail in your answer. Now, I know that this is a major area of concern for D3 candidates because there is such a huge amount to cover. My interpretation of these examiners' reports is that they are largely in line with what I teach in my Diplomatherapy course. So in Module 6 of Diplomatherapy, I cover exactly how much detail you need to extract and learn from the online book. So I've got a few examples here from the October report. So first of all, do remember that you are able to omit one question in each paper, so choose it carefully. So for question 1, the examiners commented that if during the planning process it becomes clear that there is insufficient knowledge to formulate an adequate answer, then it is better to consider another question. So do do remember that you are allowed to omit one in each paper. But there are ways of intelligently using your understanding of the D1 and the D2 concepts, as long as, if we talk about one of the previous mistakes I mentioned, as long as you blend these with enough regional detail from D3. So again, going back to the question 4 on the Australian regions, they give an example of that there. So read what the examiners have mentioned there. And then this theme comes up again in question 7. The bit where the examiners say that the danger is that answers revert to a generic discussion of viticulture and winemaking that is not specific to the region. So you must learn enough detail from D3 to be able to apply these D1 concepts intelligently. And again, I explore this in more detail in Diplomatherapy. If you are gunning for a distinction, there is no getting away from it. You will need to learn plenty of detail. This is where you're going to need to be looking at knowing your exact yield numbers, your exact rainfall numbers, all that kind of things. And they also expect high scoring candidates to give examples of specific producers. So in question 7, they say quite a few candidates included examples of producers in their answers, which was encouraging. So again, the amount of detail that you include is going to be linked to the grade which you are targeting. So how do you fix mistake number 4? Now, this is very individual to you and the way that you learn and memorize material, the grade you're aiming for, and the amount of time that you have to study. But overall, my advice for most people who do not realistically have the time to aim for a distinction grade would be to strike a good balance between, on the one hand, not learning all the detail from the D3 book and relying more on a solid understanding of the underlying concepts. And on the other hand, still extracting just enough of that regional localized detail from the book so that you can meet the examiner's requirements. And again, I help with this inside Diplomatherapy. Mistake number 5. This is where people do not answer the questions on these less familiar regions adequately. So we, of course, have classic parts of the syllabus. I like to call them the core parts of the syllabus, France, Germany, Spain, all the sort of famous regions of Europe, and then the classic regions of the New World. But then there are the areas that are lesser known. And this is always going to be a challenge when it comes to D3, because there will usually be a question that includes at least one lesser known area. And in a way, it's potluck if it happens to be an area with which you are more familiar or which you happen to have studied more recently. So in question 5 in the October report, we're reminded that in order to be well prepared for this exam, you do need to have covered all the bases, even if it's not in 100% detail. And the examiners made the comment that this question highlights the need for students to revise thoroughly and broadly, not just focusing on the more famous regions. How do you fix this mistake? Well, we go back to allocate enough time in your study plan to cover the whole syllabus. You've got to be very committed. I'm going to give you tough love here. No pain, no gain is a saying for a reason. And you're not going to achieve D3 theory if you don't put the time into it. You will also have to develop your memory skills. If you're someone who also has a very hectic life with not much study time, many of us have crazy work lives, intense family lives, it might then for you be a good idea to extend the time before you take the D3 exam. This will give you the time to chip away at it for a longer period, and otherwise you may end up retaking it anyway. Only do this though if you genuinely will keep chipping away at it, otherwise you'll end up in the same position.
And Anne, I think that the thing that would really bring that to life, for me and for the listeners, is maybe just to give some examples of what some of those lesser known regions have been.
Certainly, yes. In the October 2021 exam, which is mainly what I'm referring to today, for instance, they asked about Greece. Now, of course, we know that the wines of Greece have become much better known recently, but it still probably would be described as a less classic country. In the same paper, they then also asked about the red wines produced in Burgenland and Baden. Again, not so classic. And then finally, there was a question on 2 lesser known parts of Italy. So when we think of Italy, we're all kind of learning our Tuscany and our Piedmont, but they asked about the white wines of the Marche and the red wines of the Abruzzo. Mistake number 6, and this is a big one, is not applying enough analysis in your answers. Diploma level theory answers require a lot of analytical skills and making links. And you may think that this only applies if you've got one of those more analytical command verbs in your question, like assess or evaluate. But I have observed that this can sometimes apply even if the wording of the question is describe or what are the characteristics of, which might appear to require description rather than analysis. So for instance, in question 5 in this October exam, which was on the characteristics of Chenin Blanc, I was interested to note that despite this seemingly descriptive instruction, what are the characteristics of, the examiner still required some analysis, some linking. So for instance, for each point addressed, you needed to explain what it meant. So you can't just say, Chenin Blanc has high acidity. You have to link that to the fact that that means it's crucial, that acidity is crucial for the wide range of styles. You can't just say, oh, it's early budding but late ripening. You have to link that to the fact that it's therefore suited to cool climates, etc. In other cases, though, the need for analysis is much more clearly signposted. So that question that we've talked about on strengths and weaknesses of Greece, the command verb was assess. So that means that candidates were expected to go beyond simply listing a variety of strengths and weaknesses and to provide an evaluation of each of them. They also commented on the skillful use of analysis in question 3, and the very best candidates there made links between the first and the second part of the question. So that was on Carmenere and Torrentes. So the best candidates lifted ideas that they had presented in their commentary on the great characteristics, and then they used those to comment on the opportunities and challenges for Carmenere and Torrentes wines in the marketplace. Another command verb that indicates the need for analysis is compare. So I refer again to question 4, the one on Australian wine regions. We talked about that when we looked at logical structure. So in my opinion, actually, using your answer structure in order to draw effective comparisons between the 3 regions is a really good way of meeting that requirement for analysis. A very classic question format like number 7 also requires analysis. So keep an eye out for this format. How do factors in the vineyard and winery influence the style of X? If you see a question format like that, you will be in trouble if you simply describe the factors. So the examiners make this comment: meaningless statements such as high or low temperatures may be used for fermentation, or canopy management is carried out, should be avoided. No credit can be given for this without further explanation. You've got to explain it more. So what are the effects of different temperatures on wine style, for example, or what sort of canopy management is done and what is the resulting effect on the wine style? So how do you fix mistake number 6? So my first piece of advice, as I've mentioned already, revisit this document, which is entitled Level 4 Wines Theory Guidance, available from the online classroom of your APP. Refresh your memory on what is required from each command verb, and they also there explain what the higher skill of analysis is. If I were to explain it simply to you here today, I would say that it means stating why something is the case and making links, for example, between the production factors and the resultant style, quality, or price, rather than just repeating facts. So for instance, this conversation I'm having with you today, Lawrence, this is analytical. So rather than merely summarizing what the examiners have said, I have drawn out themes and I have given you my interpretation of each of these themes with examples to illustrate each point where possible and my opinion on how you can improve your performance. And that is analysis. So if analysis is something that you, the listener, struggle with, then try always to have these questions in your mind. So first, why is this the case? what would be the consequences of this thing I've just described? And then finally, what links can I make between this and the style, quality, and price of the wine? Have these questions at the forefront of your mind when you're answering any question, and you are much more likely to be incorporating analysis. Mistake number 7 is not answering the question properly. This appears over and over again in examiners' reports, and October 2021 is no different. So this is clearly something that people are not addressing. So to give you a couple of examples, in question 1 of the October exam, some people either completely missed that the question specified white wines, or they didn't have enough information, so they wrote about red wines anyway. So please don't do this. It immediately undermines the examiner's confidence in you. Likewise, in that question on Chenin Blanc, understanding the nuance of the question was key, because the examiners say in their commentary that those who did less well tended to focus on the characteristics of the wine made from Chenin Blanc rather than on the variety itself. Now, this is subtle, but it did make a difference to performance, and that could risk leading to more of a level 3 standard of answer, which will not gain you many marks. In question 6, many people, and to quote the examiners here, offered lengthy discussions on white wines and white winemaking, and some omitted to reference one or more of the 3 factors that should have been discussed. So these mistakes could have been easily avoided. In this question, they also emphasize the importance of knowing your command verbs, something I've mentioned a few times. They say that the strongest answers all focused on the key command verb explain, providing an informed and balanced response by exploring both regions and the 3 factors in turn. And then finally, in question 7, there were some who made points that were completely irrelevant to the question. So they say that discussion of the use of cultured yeasts, fining, filtration, and clarification was also unnecessary. These things are not key influences on wine style in this case. Discussion of export markets or routes to market in general was irrelevant. So I would say to you, adding irrelevant information, although it may seem very appealing when you can't remember everything that you think you need to answer the question and you want to fill up the space, it's still pointless. It won't gain you any marks. And once again, it will undermine the examiner's confidence in your answer and thus in your whole script. So how do you fix mistake number 7? Well, first, the obvious point, and I'm sure you've had this said to you many times, is read the question properly. And it may sound absurdly obvious, but it's amazing how your brain can behave under exam pressure. Underline those keywords in the question and keep referring back to those as you answer to make sure that you haven't missed anything. If exam pressure is something that you struggle with, and if it prevents you from thinking clearly about a question, it's worth trying to put as many measures in place as you can to help with this. And I've got lots of tips in my Diplomatherapy program. Next, I would say create a solid plan for your answer. And at a couple of points whilst you're writing the answer, make sure that you sense check yourself by going back to your underlined keywords and back to your plan so that you can ensure you're not wandering off on a tangent unrelated to the question. My final tip for avoiding this mistake would be review the earlier sections of today's podcast where we talk about structure and analysis, because these are very much interlinked with the degree to which you will answer the question properly. And particularly important are the links between production factors and, yes, you've guessed it, the style, quality, and price of the wines. These links are so important, and that's why my Diplomatherapy study template encourages you to make these links when you're extracting information from the book. That way you're already halfway there when it comes to making these links in the exam, and that will save you huge time under pressure. The final mistake, which I've drawn out of the October 2021 examiner's report, is perhaps a more minor one. It's the misspelling of key wine terms. In general, examiners are lenient when it comes to small spelling and grammar errors because, after all, many of you are answering these exams as non-native English speakers. And that in itself is a huge achievement, huge respect from me to you if you are answering this exam and English is not your first language. I studied French at university and I only had to write one entire exam in French, and it was so challenging. So huge respect to you. But of course, wine regions and most wine labeling terms are all spelled the same way, no matter what the language is. So because of that, they do expect these to be spelled correctly. So how do you fix this mistake? Well, obviously, I don't want you to allocate a large percentage of your very precious and limited study time to learning spellings. But it is important to aim for spelling a majority of these wine terms correctly. So set a little bit of time aside to focus on the spellings of wine terms in languages that you're less familiar with. And then one little aside, perhaps a miscellaneous point, just to tie in nicely at the end of mistake number 8, is that I would advise that you practice your handwriting, because how many of us these days do most of our writing on a keyboard? But then suddenly you're expected to write for all this time, and you're expected to write legibly. So examiners will have hundreds of scripts to mark, and they will not have a lot of patience when it comes to deciphering illegible answers, especially if they are also accompanied by consistently badly misspelled wine terms. So that is something not to overlook.
Thanks so much, Anne. It's always a pleasure to have you back on. And, I'm sure, given the feedback I've received on your previous appearance, that today's podcast will be a huge help for people who are looking at doing the D3 exam in the diploma, the most challenging exam out there. And thank you as well for just headlining your own program that you've put together to help people in this exam. And I think, it would be great to leave our listeners with you just giving us an outline of how that program really came to be, a little bit about what's included. And also I know that there are some specific deadlines and dates that people need to pay attention to if they're interested.
Absolutely, Lawrence, yes. So Diplomatherapy, the name is no accident. It came from my own experience of studying for the diploma and finding it really quite mentally challenging and realizing that people do need that little bit of extra support. So I don't offer therapy sessions as such, but there is a sort of therapeutic component to my coaching style, because I like to remember what it was like for me going through that and really be compassionate about, what people are experiencing. It's not just about sitting down with the books and studying. There's a psychological aspect to succeeding at this exam as well. And so Diplomatherapy is a course that I created basically to teach the methods that I myself used when I was studying for D3 to get from that feeling of complete overwhelm to that eventual success in the exam. So that's what Diplomatherapy is. And then in 2023, I have added some elements to Diplomatherapy, some more live support based on what students have told me that they need help with. So the live support elements that I've added are, first of all, accountability. So that's going to be a weekly check-in from me and my team. Have you done the bits of your study plan that you said you were going to do last week? If not, why have you not done them? And when are you going to catch up on them? So that accountability piece, I think, is something that people struggle with because it's so easy to drift into procrastination. We see the vast amount of material and we almost feel like there's no point in beginning. So accountability. And then the other thing that I've added is more support with the theory part. The great thing about delivering an online program is that we don't need to get wine samples out to people all around the world. But with the theory, we can do that anywhere. So people can join for live masterclasses where I will be looking at exact examples of past or sample questions, how to break those down, how to approach the structure of those questions. And I've run masterclasses like this in the past, which people have reported were extremely helpful for them. We'll also have some guest experts appearing, so we'll be voting on those once everyone's in the program. But I'd like to have people talking about things like how to cope with exam stress, how to motivate yourself, the psychology around goal setting and motivation, how to be disciplined. And then we can have as well, from my extensive network, some subject specialists looking at specific D3 topics as well. So lots of exciting updates. I also have a couple of premium private coaching spots, which are very limited because of my limited time. But that is also an option for anyone who has the funds to invest. We are enrolling people for Diplomatherapy at the moment, and there isn't a deadline as such for joining the program, but the price will be going up at the end of January. So if you'd like to join us, I know that many people are currently focusing on their D4 and D5 exams. Some are working on the D6 assignment, but it's important not to leave preparation for D3 theory too late. So if you want to get on board before the end of January, you'll benefit from the early bird pricing. Then the investment will be going up. But after that, you'll have my continued support up until the May exams. People have also asked me if they're taking the exam in October, should they still join? And I always say it's never too early to get into the right mindset for this exam. So yes, I'd recommend it.
A huge thanks to McHale MW for your time today. As I'm sure you'll agree, a spectacular resource for you or anyone you know who is taking the D3 exam in May 2023. I'm delighted to say that I've partnered with Anne to offer a number of bonuses for Interpreting Wine listeners who sign up to her Diplomatherapy program before May 2023. To register your interest, head to interpretingwine.com/diploma23. You can also find this link in the description below. That's all for this special episode. See you next time.